We are here today with visiting professor and actual professor David Blair. David is the author of 5 books. His most recent are Barbarian Seasons and Walk Around, Essays on Poetry and Place, both from Mad Hat Press. Links to all of his work in the description. David, welcome to Balderdash Academy.
Nice to be with you, Bob, and everybody.
So, I have a quick question. You were mentioning how, in the break, you were mentioning how you had a poem that you didn't put into a book. And what I'm wondering is, so when you are selecting work for your book, how do you go about making those selections? I mean, to me, it seems like it's almost like choosing songs for an album. You want them to fit a certain theme or a certain tone, right?
Yeah, it's like that. You know, you want to have like a good opening shot, like good, like it's got to be Blitzkrieg Bop at the beginning of a book, and you want to have something that's kind of like good kind of sense of closure, and then you don't want things to drag, so somebody's reading, there's like a rhythm to the whole thing, be like, oh, and then you sometimes have to, things change their meaning, you put them next to each other, and you realize, it's kind of the same thing. I said basically the same thing there, so I'll throw that one out, and then just kind of like, you kind of intuit it that way. A lot of people have different ways. Like Ivan's friend Doug, he says, you put a good one at the beginning, you put a good one at the middle, and your best one in the beginning, second best one in the middle, and another really great one at the end. Because when people are in a bookstore and they browse, they either look at the beginning, the middle, or the end, right? So somebody will go, oh, I like that one. Yeah, that one's really good too. And then what's at the end is also very good. Then you're like, hey, you're gonna maybe make a sale. But I don't really think that way, But that's a good. That would be a masterful way.
Good for Doug.
Doug would be.
Way to go, Doug.
Yeah.
I have a question that I think sort of follows into what you were just mentioning. What is the editing process like when you're writing poetry? Like, I've only ever edited, professional emails that I've been attempting to sound like a professional in. I read it out loud and then I look for spelling errors. It must be very different for, I would assume it's very different for poetry. What's that editing process like for you? Well,
it just takes a long time. You live with them, you hang out with them for a couple of years, and I like to change things a little bit. I'll look at them all, I make small changes, and then they need different things to different kind of work, but some of the things, does that make sense? Does it have too many words? Did I mess up some sort of rhythm thing? Like there's kind of things you have to do. There's like the line, you have to mess around with the line, there's the sentence, and then and then sometimes just, cutting things or flipping things, changing order. There's all sorts of different things you do,
Now, we've had a number of stand-up comics on the show. I used to do comedy. I've hung out with a number of comics and poets.
Yeah.
They're not too dissimilar, I've discovered, right? So,
that's true.
They both craft their raw material out of spontaneous inspiration or observation, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the work and refine, the pace, tempo, riffs. They often drink too much, sleep too little. So how do you balance that, the open burst of creation with the dedicated minutia of refinement? Like, are they different to you?
Well, that was poetry in itself, Bob.
I love that. That's the whole thing. That's the best part about it. Is it's all a process, you have to woodshed every morning, and have part of the thing where you just start playing around, and you have to have a sense of play, and then you want to keep that. And then the other stuff is not really like requiring like heavy dedication. I think it's more of it's just kind of it's a gift. It's fun, it makes life. It's a lot of pleasure in the writing process, having something like gardening or cooking. All the good things are processes. I think, so it's kind of like just do your process. You don't really think about it. But I think it's true. Like you have to make it if it doesn't feel, that's something like people have said, if it doesn't feel close to the spontaneous, then you've you probably didn't have a very good idea to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And it's, like sometimes you'll do that. You'll get like an idea and you'll be like, oh, I had this great kind of feeling or this vision, and I can feel it, and then it, you write it and go, oh, that doesn't really good, and I'm like, I'm just gonna maybe redo it and I'm just gonna go much faster. I'm just not gonna think about it.
That's what I did with my second kid.
Yeah, exactly. I like that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, you're a professor as well. What brought you into teaching?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's fun. It's good to work with people. You don't have to sit down at a desk too much. You have weird hours. You get to interact with people, and there's a kind of element of it that's not probably you get to put language in the air and hear it, right? And you get to introduce people to good things. That's all. There's a lot of pleasure involved in it. You would like doing that. People who I used to like waiting tables, and I used to like working in restaurants, and part of it was like, oh, let's have some good stuff here.
Yeah.
And the teaching is one of those things where you're always doing something that's really good, and you help people too. They get good things out of it, but it's a lot of part of it is almost like a big it's constantly doing something that's good and bringing people things that are good.
It's like captaining your own starship.
Pleasure involved in it. So
well, that's
great.
I mean, that's really similar to what you were talking about in the Tupelo Quarterly article with when Catherine Hollander interviewed you. You said that one of the benefits of poetry, or why poetry is important, is that it makes people aware of their affection for other people and for the environment, for the things that are reasonable and good.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings up and touches on not only the beauty of poetry and why it's important, but also why many people now during the pandemic are gravitating or trying to discover poetry as either an outlet or as a release. So to some people who don't just understand you can just pick up a book, to make it more approachable, if someone was looking to start reading poetry, where should they start? Where would you recommend?
Oh, I'd read, poets that are like fun to read, that have a feeling of spontaneity to them, that make you look at the world, like William Carlos Williams and Langston Hughes. Those are like poets I read when I was, 18 years old, and I was living in New York, and you'd look around, go take a walk and ride the subway and read, Montage of a Dream Deferred or Patterson, and you feel like there's all that, that kind of stuff is good. And I think like listening to music I listen to a lot of jazz, and I feel like that kind of like anybody who enjoys everybody who enjoys consciousness, like your own mental process, poetry is great, right? The same way music is, and comedy, you listen to like, I don't know, like a Lenny Bruce album. So what I used to listen to, like when I was year I first started writing poetry every day, and I decided I wasn't going to get a regular job. I obsessively would listen to like Lenny Bruce albums and jazz albums just constantly, and it felt like, hey, that's like, you're dealing with consciousness, right? And I think that people like that you get more out of life if you have a sense of liberation and freedom, and also of having a body, living in a physical world. So that's all in poetry, and it's good for that. So other people have different reasons for it, that they like, and they have pain, like that there's a therapy, that there's things that speak, very deeply about the nature of trauma, right? And, you'd probably, that's almost like that's another thing that poetry can do, but that wasn't necessarily my kind of, entrance into,
Yeah.
you know. I used to like drama, you know, and I figure like, you know, kind of like they kind of, you know, caused problems for yourself. You know, I figured it was more interesting to look at an art that would make you not feel suffering. You know, right? You know, so there's a kind of a suffering party and a non-suffering party. I'm not in the suffering party.
Good. David, how do you feel about Iambic Pentameter?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Who was that?
Flexible, kind of good old meter, you know, like there's a lot of good ones, you know, that works pretty good with speech, you know, and,
Yeah.
right? It lends itself naturally to that. And you don't have to be you could kind of be loosely have meters going and things like that. But how do you feel about Iambic Pentameter?
Shakespearean language is something that I've always struggled with, and one of my really bad actor habits is at the end of the line pausing and then continuing on with the next line, which is not exactly how Shakespeare intended it, but that's something that, like, in my, like, just the visualness of it, like when I'm reading a piece of poetry, I feel as though there is, even if it's just half a stop at the end of the line before you go to the next line, is how my brain interprets it. But I know that's not exactly how the playwright or the poet intended it to be read out loud.
It's like his two hands, right? Like you're playing, there's the line thing that's going on, but really what you read is the sentence.
Yeah.
Like there's an overlay of two kinds of things that are going on there. And just like the sentence usually, you know. I mean, Iambic Pentameter is really strange because I think when I was a kid and trying to figure out the way poems scan, you know, I would a lot of times, like, we would try to write a pentameter. My friend and I tried to write pentameters, and we wrote trochees, right? Like stress, stress, unstress, stress, unstress, stress, unstress. And I think what we were hearing is that people in southwestern Pennsylvania speak downhill, right? Like hip hop, right? A lot of times it's trochaic, right? And it's an American meter, and that Iambic Pentameter is like works best. And I didn't invent this; other people have said this, but it's the ascending rhythms of English upper class speech more. And so when American poets play with pentameter, a lot of times they can be, sometimes, you know, they can be, they have to figure out ways to sound that way. But so that's part of one of the problems with pentameter is being a, you know, iambic thing. But I don't think that, you know, the way they teach meter is terrible, right? Like, so it's very bad. It makes people hate poetry.
Yeah.
You have to have a good teach
I don't even think they teach most. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. I love it, but you know, I also, I don't know. I'm stubbornly interested in it. You know?
Yeah.
So, in my experience with poetry in general, especially being the student in high school, mostly, when it came to the rhythm and when it came to like learning pentameter, learning structure, they were too focused on the structure and not using the structure as a means to sculpt the language.
Yeah.
And poetry, much like jazz, much like Lenny Bruce's comedy, right? It was more structural and sculptural than it was this hard set fast rule that you had to learn and that everything fits within this rule.
Yeah. You know, it's like the tone. Like if once you hear the tone, like, you know, everybody, they teach meter in this way that's really artificial, that it's like apart from tone. But when you figure out the tone of an utterance and then you read it and then you read like Keats, you're like, oh my God, that you can totally hear it, you know, what's going on. And it's, you know, you listen to like what's actually being said and then almost like not pay attention to the meter. And then you know, just if you can kind of go, okay, it's like these are unstresses, those are stresses, but you know.
Yeah.
It's more holistic.
Well, I mean,
probably the way to hear it.
You know, when you guys are talking about like poetry and the structure and how it can be taught very structured, and then Iambic Pentameter has a specific structure. But I find in poetry, you use the line breaks and the punctuation to really sculpt the pace and the way you want your reader to read it. And so I think when a lot of people are starting out reading poetry, they don't really understand that because there is a beautiful cadence that is very intentional from the poet when they're writing it.
Yeah. But they don't want to learn anything about sentences, right? So like students will just like not punctuate anything because they're not writing good sentences. Right. And if you start if you start adding the punctuations, you're like, damn, that's choppy. Like, those aren't, that's not writing. Right.
Punctuation was going to be my next question was, do you even use it?
Yeah, I love
It's important.
Yeah.
In poetry.
Well, I mean, but it's different in poetry because you're not writing a full sentence and then adding a period necessarily.
Yeah. Well, the poets who don't use punctuation are really good. If you add the punctuation, a lot of times, it's really amazing. Like, pick like a W.S. Merwin poem, and you add the punctuation, you're like, oh, it's Henry James.
Right.
Or not like a bunch of like, things that are, just the same subject, verb, period.
Or you could go totally E. Cummings on it and just like use the shape to like, the sky is candy.
And sometimes he does that, but he writes a lot of damn sentences too.
Yeah, he sure does,
Or you can just go Christopher Walken and take out all the punctuation.
I have friends who don't punctuate. It's amazing. Like they can be really masterful too, but it's not that they're not getting away from syntax.
Right.
And like writing.
Yeah.
Right.
See, to me though, like poetry is just like music. You have to hear it. You have to read it out loud. It's not a quiet medium. It needs to exist in the space.
Yeah.
And when you look at it as a reader or somebody who reads it that way, what is punctuation? Punctuation is instructions to the reader on where to pause, how to pause, what inflection goes where, what's that cadence and rhythm. And that, I think, can be introduced through punctuation.
Yeah.
More than just in poetry. I mean, in plays.
I think it's also
in everything.
Subject and verb. It's like the parts that make the engine go.
Yeah.
The charge, right? And it's like, you kind of like, okay, like any like weird that you do with phrases and clauses, that's all about doing something with the subject and the verb, right? So it's like there's this active kind of like drama of this going on with, with the sentence itself. It's, that's going on there. There was a funny, I don't know how to
Okay. When you go back to your first books and the first poems you wrote, are they like old friends, or do you go, oh wow, like where was I in this space at that time, or are you really critical of it? Because as a writer, I feel like I'm very critical of the poetry I wrote, 8 years ago.
Well, like it's like my first book. There's one poem I wrote when I was 23, and it came out when I was 37, so like most of those poems I'm like pretty much I can read them and I'm like, yeah, that's still good. I mean, I don't have that, but if I went and I like read my like master's thesis, I would be like, ooh, this juvenilia. Or sometimes I'll find like an old notebook, like with my old writing and all that, and and I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. I'll throw it out for the copy, right? Other things too, like if you read a letter you wrote when you were a kid, right? You're a dumbass. Unbelievable, right? And you go like, oh, here I was trying to impress this person, and I was like super full of myself, pompous, and trying to sound, like you could see all of that, like yourself too well. You're like, oh, that's. But the poems, I don't feel that way. I feel like I burned all of that out. Right? Like if I had always been operating at that level, I would have been a completely different kind of person. But
there's a science to it. And speaking of science, join us as we return for our STEAM pop quiz and Lie Again, only on Balderdash Academy. Go Dashers!
I thought you were going to say a steampunk quiz.
An apple a day keeps the cyborgs away. Thankfully, Marie has a whole orchard full of them while making a commercial. Or does she? Find out in the next episode of Balderdash Academy, where we play Lie, Lie Again.
Yeah, I write a lot of crap. I throw out a lot, you know.
Yeah,
Just like-
I think you have to
like,
as a writer.
Yeah.
I have to throw that out.
That's most of my college.
You were in law college. Bob was one of my students.
Wait, really?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's already like right, we're like the same age.
Oh, wow.
You know, like you know, I'd be like, oh, you don't really need me to tell you anything about this.
No.
It's really good. You know, we just
Yeah.
hang out.
I needed the credit, and I got a friend out of it, so it was.
We just hung out. You know, we talked
Yeah.
about.
That's a win.
You know, it's like having well, you know.
Thank you for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. You can find us on your favorite podcast service as Balderdash Academy. Go Dashers!